from the studios of Postscript Media and Canary Media.
I lived in Washington, D.C. for many years, and I became accustomed to the random ad campaigns focused on some niche legislative topic that would pop up around the city, often on bus stops or inside the metro or in a newspaper. But when ad campaigns suddenly appear in major newspapers that fall directly in your line of industry expertise, it's always a little arresting. And that's what happened to the London-based hydrogen analyst Adithya Bhashyam when he saw multiple full-page spreads in American newspapers recently. Okay, so in July, this industry coalition took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. Can you describe this ad for me?
Yeah, this was an ad by the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association, which is an association sort of promoting the use of hydrogen in the US. Some of the members are ExxonMobil and Constellation Energy. And this ad basically says America cannot reach our goals without clean hydrogen, and additionality could undercut it all. And it has a big sign on there saying factory closure.
So 2 days later, another set of green groups took out a full-page ad. This was in the Washington Post, and describe this one for me.
A number of green groups, including the Environmental Defense Fund and NRDC and Evergreen Action, were posting an ad in the Washington Post saying, don't spend billions on pollution, keep climate pollution out of the clean hydrogen tax credit. So basically arguing for more strict requirements on the production of clean hydrogen.
Interestingly, these are ads that use the words like additionality, hourly matching, deliverability. Did you ever expect that there would be ads with these terms in them?
Not really, because the average news consumer will have probably never come across any of these terms before. So I guess the point is to not to necessarily address the average consumer, but potentially policymakers who have an influence on this.
What is happening right now?
Well, in August last year, the US came up with the Inflation Reduction Act, a massive subsidy package across the clean energy transition, but particularly with a very lucrative tax credit for the production of clean hydrogen, promising up to $3 per kilogram for the cleanest form of hydrogen with the lowest emissions. And at the time, it delegated the authority to set the emissions standard and how that clean hydrogen can be produced to the US Treasury to issue guidance within 1 year on how that clean hydrogen can be produced. And that's coming out by mid-August. And there's potentially billions of dollars of subsidy money involved. We estimated, I think, over $120 billion in subsidies that could go to all the announced clean hydrogen projects.
There is a fierce debate raging in the U.S. over how to set standards for hydrogen. Those standards will determine who benefits from tax credits, and more importantly, whether America's push for green hydrogen will make or break our efforts to clean up industry.
Without any restrictions on hydrogen production from grid electricity, the emissions of hydrogen production in the U.S. could be double that from producing just hydrogen from fossil fuels directly. So it's quite substantial in terms of the emissions.
This is The Carbon Copy. I'm Stephen Lacey. This week, a U.S. decision on tax credits for green hydrogen is imminent. Bloomberg analyst Adithya Bhashyam joins us to talk about how it might play out, how Europe might influence the outcome, and why we need green hydrogen in the first place. The Carbon Copy is supported by Fish Tank PR. In this turbulent and exciting energy transition, your approach to communicating with journalists, investors, and customers must evolve. Whether you need to position yourself as a thought leader in between project announcements or translate complex ideas and technologies into tangible, compelling content, Fish Tank can help. To learn more about Fish Tank's approach, visit Fish Tank PR. That's FISCH Tank PR. And if you're looking for your next role in PR or media relations, check out Fish Tank's open job listings. The Carbon Copy is brought to you by Savant. No home can be truly smart without smart power. Savant Power Systems let you monitor, store, and control your home's energy, putting the power to live comfortably and sustainably in your hands. The award-winning Savant app tracks real-time energy production to enable maximum efficiency during blackouts and peak energy pricing periods. The Savant Power System. Focus your energy. Learn more at savant.com, SAVANT, savant.com. Okay, so we've been talking about the hydrogen economy since the George W. Bush administration. There was a lot of attention on fuel cells in the early 2000s, but they just couldn't compete outside of niche applications. But as we get serious about cleaning up industry, hydrogen is once again being taken very seriously as a tool. We use a lot of hydrogen today in petroleum refining, chemicals production, metals treatment. The U.S. currently uses about 10 million metric tons of it. It primarily comes from splitting hydrogen and carbon molecules apart from methane, fossil gas. If we can get that hydrogen from renewables, you can use it to clean up industrial applications. You could also use it as a storage medium, converting electrons from the sun and wind into storable molecules, and then turning them back into electricity through a fuel cell or hydrogen-fired power plant. You can also use hydrogen to make synthetic fuels. People call it a Swiss Army knife for decarbonization. Adithya Bhashyam is an associate hydrogen analyst at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and he's closely tracking the rise and cost trajectory of green low-carbon hydrogen. And how we define and promote that hydrogen has become a flashpoint in Europe, in the US. So I caught up with him to understand how this is playing out right now.
So there's two forms of low-carbon hydrogen, right? One is just adding carbon capture and storage to the existing fossil hydrogen plant and reducing the emissions of that. The other form, which is sort of the newer technology, is to use water and split that water into hydrogen and oxygen in an electrolyzer using renewable electricity. Based on the announced projects that we are seeing out to 2030, we see about 8 million metric tons of clean hydrogen, so both forms proposed, which is about 80% of what the US is using today and about 80% of the US DOE's target as well.
So it's been a year since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed and the IRA created this new tax credit for clean hydrogen. And the bill did create some language around how to calculate emissions and what classifies clean hydrogen. But that calculation raised concerns as well, and it quickly spawned this debate between industry and environmentalists and people within the industry. So as officials start to craft and finalize the language for these tax credits, how did the debate start picking up?
The debate really picked up first in Europe about a year ago. It's because the realization is that just producing hydrogen using an electrolyzer doesn't guarantee it's clean or low carbon, right? Because if in the US, for example, if you plug an electrolyzer into the electricity grid and don't do anything to that, and don't set any standards, that hydrogen has double the emissions intensity of just producing hydrogen from natural gas directly. So you need some more requirements than just procuring hydrogen from electricity from the grid, right? So the US said that clean hydrogen needs to be produced at a low carbon way, and that those emissions need to be measured over the life cycle of that production of that plant. And while that's already a good standard, what it doesn't account for is the sort of the consequential emissions that hydrogen produces by taking renewable electrons away from other uses on the grid. And that's really what this new hydrogen guidance that should be issued by mid-August is trying to regulate. And that's where most of the debate is on.
How contentious has it gotten?
Very contentious. The debate is really formed around three pillars. The first one is so-called additionality or new clean supply. It states that clean hydrogen from the grid should only be produced from new renewables that have come online and that are dedicated to that hydrogen production. It states that you need to match your hydrogen production on an hourly basis or some sort of temporal correlation for hydrogen production and renewable energy generation. And finally, it mentions that the third pillar is that the renewable energy generation needs to be close, geographically speaking, to the hydrogen generation. And these are really the three points of argument between environmental groups and industries potentially looking at producing clean hydrogen.
And there are definitely clear lines between environmental groups and the hydrogen industry, but it's not as simple as that. There is debate within the hydrogen industry itself. So how do we see those lines separating the different sides of the debate?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In general, environmental groups are more in favor of stricter regulation on these criteria, while most of industry is not. But there's many exceptions to that rule. Companies who are really interested in producing large volumes of clean hydrogen, like Air Products, and manufacturers of electrolyzers like Electric Hydrogen have come out in favor of very stringent standards on hydrogen production. Whereas others like Plug Power, which is also an electrolyzer manufacturer, doesn't really favor very strict standards on hydrogen production. And then there's a bunch of companies in the middle of this debate which want some rules on clean hydrogen production from the grid, like NextEra Energy in the US, but are arguing for a phase-in of these requirements over time. So giving some sort of transition period to most companies to be able to adopt these rules later.
So let's talk about what happens if rules are too loose. What does that mean for emissions? And then if the rules are too stringent, do you see any potential curbing of these projects beyond what's already been announced?
The worst case is really that there's really no requirements for hydrogen production from grid electricity, which means in the end, you end up creating more emissions than what fossil hydrogen production is already creating today. So let's say the US actually reaches its goal of 10 million metric tons of clean hydrogen production, and that is produced using grid electricity-powered electrolyzers. You're adding another 200 million metric tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's really the worst case that loose rules will enable. Stringent requirements, on the other hand, mean that that hydrogen production using electrolyzers is actually emissions reducing, potentially 95% lower than the fossil alternative that you have. And potentially even more if you consider all the positive effects electrolyzers can have on the electricity grid, providing some sort of system balancing services to the grid.
The Carbon Copy is supported by Fish Tank PR, a media relations and corporate comms agency dedicated to elevating the work of both early-stage and established companies across clean tech, including EV infrastructure, solar plus storage, grid edge tech, software, renewable energy project development, financing, and more. When you're looking for a PR firm, not many of them discuss transparently what drives results. Fish Tank has been in the clean tech industry for more than a decade and is able to use deep expertise to simplify messaging, collaborate effectively with clients, and consistently engage journalists. To learn more about Fish Tank's approach to clean tech and the services they offer, visit Fish Tank PR. That's FISCH Tank PR. And if you're looking for your next role, check out Fish Tank's job openings. The Carbon Copy is brought to you by Savant. With the launch of its intelligent power system, Savant is redefining what it means to own a truly smart home. The new Savant power system features the ability to monitor, store, and control electricity from the grid and solar to optimize everyday energy efficiency, offset peak utility costs, or maximize stored power to keep your family comfortable and safe during grid outages. The award-winning Savant app displays your energy production and consumption in real time and allows for easy-to-use control and hands-free automation. Plus, the system's scalable design means you can start small and expand as your needs change. When you're in control of your home's energy, the power to save on energy costs while protecting the environment, it's in your hands. The Savant Power System. Focus your energy. Learn more at savant.com, SAVANT, savant.com. So how do you think this is going to play out in the U.S. as we get closer to the final language around the tax credit for hydrogen? I mean, what indications are you getting about where the Biden administration will land on this?
Yeah, if I had to guess, I mean, the US is not the first market to set these rules. The European Union already has set rules, which are now legislated. And if I guess that I would say the US will closely align with those rules for a number of reasons. And those rules are basically have strict requirements for all these criteria, but allow for some phase-in period over time until most of these criteria come into effect. So the US guidance is likely to follow these three pillars that are outlined on additionality, temporal matching, and deliverability or geographic correlation. With some sort of phase-in, particularly on the requirement for additionality, so for new renewable energy resources, and on hourly matching. So maybe starting with something more looser on the temporal correlation side, something like annual or monthly. Monthly has been implemented in Europe, for example, and then moving to hourly matching over time. And in Europe, for example, deliverability or geographic correlation is already a requirement from the get-go. So this could be implemented in the US as well.
So we perhaps expect the US to follow or borrow from what Europe has done. Do we expect Europe's rules to influence other regions of the world?
Yeah. So I have argued at BNEF through a variety of publications that because the EU is looking to become the largest importer of clean hydrogen globally, that means that their rules really affect hydrogen production elsewhere, particularly for markets looking to export hydrogen to Europe, and basically set a global standard for hydrogen production because Europe is just such a large hydrogen user going forward. So in that sense, the US rules would likely mirror hydrogen production rules in Europe as well.
Why do we need clean hydrogen? I mean, when you look at the European economy, the US economy, why is hydrogen so important for cleaning up the industrial economies in those regions?
Yeah, we would argue that hydrogen is essential to reaching a net zero emissions. You can get very far in terms of emissions abatement just with clean power and electrification of end users alone. That gets you like 80-90% of the way. Then adding carbon capture and storage also gets you much closer. But the final 5-6% or so of emissions abatement that you need to reaching net zero by 2050 really relies on hydrogen being used widely in the sectors that is already being used today. Hydrogen is already a chemical feedstock that is being used for things like ammonia production, which is used for fertilizers. And in sectors that have no other alternative to using hydrogen, for example, as a fuel in heavy transport like ships and planes. For steel production, hydrogen is one of the few options to produce primary steel. So it's absolutely essential that hydrogen gets scaled up if we want to reach net zero.
So you have been doing a lot of economic analyses on different forms of hydrogen, and most notably green hydrogen, and you show an important cost crossover for green hydrogen compared to gray and blue hydrogen in key markets by the end of the decade. So what is causing that economic shift, and what does it look like?
Yeah, while green hydrogen from electrolyzers is substantially more expensive today than any other form of hydrogen, whether that's gray hydrogen, which is typically produced at $1 to $2 per kilogram, and also it's more expensive than blue hydrogen, which is typically between $2 to $4 per kilogram. We do expect the cost declines in green hydrogen to be much faster than in any other technology. And that's because the cost of the core equipment could decline by 60-70% or so by the end of the decade if we scale up the equipment. That's because electrolyzers, the equipment that we use, are extremely nascent technology. We only deploy about almost a gigawatt of electrolyzers a year. If we scaled it up to potentially hundreds of gigawatts by the end of the decade and going further, we expect the cost of that equipment to decline by 50, 60, or 70% or so, which really drives cost reductions of green or renewable hydrogen below the cost of production of blue hydrogen. So it becomes the cheapest form of low carbon hydrogen going forward.
And so you have these cost reductions when it comes to electrolyzers, but there's this big question about renewable energy supply. So why is that a problem for the green hydrogen industry?
Yeah, electrolyzers are extremely power hungry, right? Each kilogram of hydrogen production today requires about 50 kilowatt hours of electricity to be supplied to that electrolyzer to produce that electricity. Electrolyzers are also not that efficient, only converting about 70% or so of the electricity that you supply into energy in the form of hydrogen. And if you're expecting to rely on green hydrogen going forward and really deploy a lot of electrolyzers to power that hydrogen production, then a lot of electricity demand will flow towards hydrogen production. If you look at our scenarios, by the end of the decade, electrolyzers alone take up a couple percentage of all electricity demand globally. By 2050, under a net zero scenario, electrolyzers producing hydrogen take up a third of all electricity demand almost, just to power themselves to produce hydrogen. So a third of all global electricity demand. And that's a problem because all of that additional demand needs to be supplied by additional renewable electricity capacity as well. And even in the near term, that can become a problem. Last year, we compared how much of the share of the forecast of renewables, so solar and wind, that we expected to be deployed by 2030 is taken up by electrolyzers. If about 20 million metric tons or so of clean hydrogen are produced globally by the end of the decade. And we got to about 16% of all the renewables we expect to deploy this decade will just go to the production of hydrogen. So this 16% that needs to be either taken away from other uses where the clean electrons could go to, or built on top of the existing renewable energy forecast that we have.
What derails green hydrogen? Is it supply chain issues? Is it the cost of electrolyzers? Is it the availability of renewable energy, additional renewable energy projects? What, if not all three of those things, could derail green hydrogen?
Yeah, it could be a combination of all those things. I mean, as I said, we haven't really installed many electrolyzers globally. We're selling about 1 gigawatt of them every year. Most of those are deployed in China. The largest electrolyzer operating outside of China is just 20 megawatts in size. And we're looking at scenarios where by the end of the decade, we need to go from a few hundred megawatts deployed today, or maybe up to 1 gigawatt deployed today, to something like 200, 250 gigawatts of electrolyzers that could be potentially built if we just look at the potential proposed projects and what we think is feasible out of those projects. So we don't really have much expertise in building these gigawatt scale plants yet. So a lot could go wrong. In terms of, if you look at the supply chain, we think there's enough proposed electrolyzer manufacturing capacity and proposals to build more electrolyzers that you could supply all those few hundred gigawatts of electrolyzers by the end of the decade if all these plants were to come online. In terms of the cost of production, with the US Inflation Reduction Act and subsidies in Europe and East Asia, those will probably level out the cost of production even at more expensive electrolyzer costs today. And then we expect with these subsidies driving deployment in the near term, long term, the cost of the electrolyzers to come down substantially as well. So the real bottleneck could be the development of renewables. There has been massive permitting issues, not only in the US, but also in Europe, that have been holding back the development of renewables. Those are being addressed in Europe, for example, by designating pre-permitted areas for renewable energy deployment. It's something that has been called for in the US as well to speed up permitting of renewables. And especially as you require additionality with hydrogen production, that could become a bottleneck, delaying the transition to a large-scale hydrogen economy. But it's not something that will stifle the build-out of electrolyzers long-term either.
Well, Adi, thank you so much for helping us sort this out.
Of course. Happy to be here.
Again, Adithya Bhashyam is an associate hydrogen analyst at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. We will link to his recent report on the economics of green hydrogen. And the Carbon Copy is a co-production of Postscript Media and Canary Media. The folks at Canary Media have been covering this extensively, so we'll provide some links to Jeff St. John's reporting on the debate over the tax credits. And this episode was produced and written by me with help from Dalvin Abawaje. Sean Marquand's our engineer. Original music came from Sean Marquand from Echo Finch, from Epidemic Sounds and Blue Dot Sessions. Postscript Media is supported by our investor, Prelude Ventures. Prelude's a venture capital firm that partners with startups, entrepreneurs that address climate change across energy, food, ag, transportation, logistics, advanced materials manufacturing, and advanced computing. And you can support this show by just hooking us up with a review on Apple, give us a rating anywhere you get the show, and send out your thoughts on social media. Just let the world know that you're listening to this show because a lot of people need to know about these trends that are unfolding in the low-carbon economy. I'm Stephen Lacey. This is The Carbon Copy. Thanks for being here. We'll catch you next time.